Things have taken kind of a turn for the strange lately, haven't they? We've gone from a global lockdown due to a fear of pandemic, and now we have erupting on all the streets of America race riots. So things aren't looking too good right now, you could say, to overstate the obvious. But I'm always on a tireless quest to put things in perspective. So I'd like to look at a time in our nation's history when things were looking a lot more bleak. Maybe we can grasp a little glimmer of hope by looking at what those who came before us were capable of overcoming. So let's take a little mental journey together, kind of like when we were kids. And let's just see if we can stretch out that childlike imagination a little. Couldn't hurt, right? Picture yourself as a doughboy out in the middle of no man's land on the battlefields of World War I. But first, let's define what a doughboy is. Probably the earliest and closest example we have of the name being used was during the Spanish War from 1846 to 1848, when American infantrymen took long treks over a dusty desert landscape, giving them the appearance of being covered in flour from head to toe. And the dust that they were covered in was also adobe soil. So another variant is that the men were called adobes, which morphed into dobies, and then later became doughboys. But whatever the origin of the name, just know this, that from here on out, you're known as a doughboy. But for now, let's step back in time a little bit. Back before that fateful journey across that wide ocean to fight in a foreign war, in a foreign land. Way back when you were still a child. You recall looking through magazines, just filled with artist depictions, glorifying the war on the Western Front. Cavalrymen chasing the enemy, valiantly riding on their horses with swords drawn, blazing in the sun. It was a childish fantasy, a naive depiction, putting a pretty face on a very ugly reality you now find yourself unable to escape. Then all of a sudden, you feel something tugging at your pant leg. It's a big rat, and apparently it's hungry. And then the smell hits your nose. It's the too familiar stench of death, and all of its many variations of putrefaction. And you're not sure if the rat is sure that you're still alive or if you're dead. There's a little carve out where you can rest, but nobody really sleeps. There is no sleep for the wicked.
Miles from home, an American army is fighting for you. Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake. Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting. Invoking the spirit of our forefathers, the Army asks your unflinching support to the end that the high ideals for which America stands may endure upon the earth.
On November 1914, a soldier was admitted with neurological symptoms that could not be attributed to any physical wounds. This is one of the earliest accounts of what would later become known as shell shock, known today as PTSD or post-traumatic stress a mental disorder caused by the stresses of combat. The following account was taken from a case record of an 18-year-old private of the London Scottish Regiment. The life in the trenches was very hard. There was considerable rain. They were not able to get water. The diet consisted of a form of corned beef they called bully beef, jam, cheese, and bread. The sand would come into the food, and this increased their thirst. They had little chance to sleep. The eye strain was very severe. Patient had a great deal to do with handling wounded and dying soldiers, which made a deep impression on him. The first day he was in a trench, he had in his line of vision a pile of corpses, one of which had the face turned towards him and appeared to be sleeping. This made an impression upon him that he cannot free himself of this vision. Just before being sent home, he was 5 days and 6 nights in the trenches, at a stretch under the above conditions. The noises made by shells and the uncertainty of where they would strike caused great uneasiness and strain. Patient's comrades remarked that he did not answer when they spoke to him, and appeared not to realize that they were speaking to him. Of this he knew nothing until told later. He could not hold his gun accurately, nor shoot accurately. He was very shaky, and he suffered much from headache. He was sent away from the trenches November 14th, and arrived at Southampton November 21st. The gas mask drill. The gas mask drill was this mad dash to put on all your protective gear as quickly as possible in the most difficult conditions. We are always to have our masks handy. We've been trained like dogs to respond to a specific whistle, alarm bell, or shout. As soon as we hear that sound, we are to jump to our feet and fumble around as efficiently as possible in a desperate effort to put on our hoods or masks and get everything sealed up, hopefully before that cloud of gas hits. Far from embracing the gas masks as a life-saving technology, soldiers felt emasculated and claustrophobic in them. One British officer explained, "We gaze at one another like goggle-eyed imbecile frogs. The mask makes you feel only half a man. The air you breathe has been filtered of all save a few chemical substances. A man doesn't live on what passes through the filter. He merely exists. He gets the mentality of a wide-awake vegetable. And on top of all that humiliation, the gas mask would not always work. Although the British and German masks were fairly reliable because of the strict quality control measures, the French masks, as you might have guessed, were notoriously unreliable. Wearing masks also made treating wounded soldiers more difficult when both stretcher bearers and injured men needed to don masks. The probability of gas attack was so frequent that over time researchers on both sides even devised masks for horses, dogs, and even somehow messenger pigeons involved in military operations. Soldiers on both sides of the conflict felt that gas warfare stretched the limits of our humanity. One man who served at the front described the psychological effects of nightly gas threats. With men trained to believe that a light sniff of gas might mean death, and with nerves highly strung by being shelled for long periods, and with the presence of not a few who really had been gassed, it is no wonder that the gas alarm went beyond all bounds. Gas horns would be honked, empty brass shell casings beaten, rifles emptied, and the mad cry would be taken up. For miles around, scared soldiers woke up in the midst of frightful pandemonium and put on their masks, only to hear a few minutes later the cry of, "All safe." 2 or 3 alarms a night were common. Gas shock was as frequent as shell shock. Kind of reminds me, in some small way, of watching the news lately. The psychological consequences of gas attacks were not limited to the fear of the air the soldiers breathed. A 1918 U.S. Army after-action report described an incident in which a platoon of machine gunners became convinced that their food was contaminated in a gas attack when a shell exploded near the men while they were eating. A soldier remembered yelling, "Gas! Gas!" And some of their food had been gassed. All the men were seized with gas fright, and a few minutes later made their way to the aid station. They came in stooping posture, holding their abdomens and complaining of pains in the stomach, while their faces bore frightened, anxious expressions. Some had even vomited. In July 1917, as the Germans began to lose their advantage of technological superiority, and therefore were at risk of losing the war, the Germans deployed a new and more troublesome chemical agent known as mustard gas. And even though mustard was used late in the war, it became known as the king of battle gases, because it eventually caused more chemical casualties than all the other agents combined, including chlorine, phosgene, and cyanogen chloride. Many gases were described as having a pleasant aroma, a sweet smell like peppered pineapple or lilac. Meanwhile, back at home, in some communities, many of the communal bonds were beginning to tear apart. People were beginning to grow more and more distrustful of their neighbors, as well as elected officials who had not exactly been completely upfront about the full extent of the Spanish flu. While many were afraid to leave their houses, unwilling to talk even to some of their closest neighbors for fear of contracting the flu from someone else's breath. And even though mask wearing was a common practice, it wasn't necessarily very effective in stopping the contagion from spreading. Some soldiers returning from the trenches had severe face-altering wounds, and if they were lucky enough, they'd be fitted with prosthetic masks of their own. Long after new grass covered the cratered, mud and blood-covered battlefields of World War I, the scars still remained on the people who lived through the horrors of the trenches. Besides the deep emotional, psychological trauma these men went through, many soldiers sustained facial deformities, mostly from wounds inflicted by newly invented machine guns, as well as shrapnel from artillery shells. The sight of all these disfigured men, or broken faces as they were called in France, as well as the masks that hid them, had a significant influence on culture. Little is known about what became of the masked men over the course of their lives. It's easy to imagine that the galvanized copper faces, painted eyes, and frozen expression elicited in their own way as much despair from loved ones and revulsion from strangers as the ravaged flesh their masks were meant to hide. Even the horror films of the 1920s relied on the shock of facial deformity. In 1925, in the movie The Phantom of the Opera, the mask pulled off Lon Chaney's distorted features is not unlike the style of mask worn by many of these scarred soldiers from the Great War, with his painted eyes and wrinkle-free skin. The goal of prosthetics was to return the soldiers' dignity and to ease their transition back into civilian life. But a mask is always a symbol of concealment, a haunting and inanimate counterfeit, leaving the mind to wonder what lies hidden beneath. It is interesting that a mask is a hindrance for us to wear. And just about the only other time when I can think of when people wear masks is when they're dressing up and playing make-believe on Halloween. But for the veterans who suffered from disfigurement, a mask was a means of hiding a ugly truth. And I wonder how many people out on the streets today with a mask on are, in a very real sense, hiding behind the mask and hiding their humanity from those around them, and are in some real sense alone in this time of what I can only explain as government-sponsored psychological warfare. And how many people already had mental scars sustained from the battle of life, who are more and more self-isolating to the point where they are completely alone in this world. And so our journey ends right back where we began, in the present.